This lesson is about exchange at the capillaries and the lymphatic system, and here are your objectives. First, we need some definitions. The blood is made up of two basic components: the plasma, which is the fluid or liquid part of the blood, and the cells. We've talked a lot about the cells so far. We haven't talked that much about the plasma. The plasma contains water and ions and proteins and a bunch of other stuff as well, like hormones and glucose. We're going to be talking a lot about the plasma today. Now remember that the capillary endothelium, or the wall of the capillary, is only one cell thick because that facilitates diffusion, having a short distance over which things need to diffuse. So imagine this is a schematic of a capillary with blood flow going in that direction. This is the capillary, and then the tissues are out here, and you can imagine that there are cells here. This is the artery or arterial side of the capillary, and this is the venous side of the capillary. This is going to connect to veins. This part over here is going to connect to arteries. Now there are two basic pressures driving fluid movement between the capillary and the fluid around the tissues. This area out here actually contains fluid, which we call tissue fluid or interstitial fluid. And that fluid is being produced by filtration of plasma out of the capillaries. And there are two pressures driving this fluid movement. There is hydrostatic pressure, or fluid pressure, out of the capillaries and into the area around the cells. So there's just higher pressure as a result of all the fluid in the capillary, and that pushes fluid out. And then there is also an osmotic pressure that is pulling fluid back in. And that osmotic pressure is due to proteins and gets a special name. We call that oncotic pressure, but it is just the same as osmotic pressure. And that's because there are proteins in the plasma in here, but as the fluid is being pressure filtered out here, not many proteins at all get out. So there are fewer proteins out here in the tissue fluid, and as a result there is greater osmotic or oncotic pressure pulling fluid back in. So there's these two basic sets of forces. There is hydrostatic pressure pushing fluid out, and then there is oncotic or osmotic pressure due to the greater number of proteins inside the capillary than outside that's pulling fluid back in. But it turns out that the balance of these is such that there's net filtration out of the capillaries and into the tissues. And in fact, that's across all your tissues on the order of about 3 liters per day of fluid that is getting out of the capillaries and into the tissues. And so we need a way of returning that. Now, this tissue fluid is also called interstitial fluid. The area in between the cells is called the interstitium, so you might see that name as well. And it's the tissue fluid that is actually in direct contact with the cells, with the body cells. So for example, muscle cells, brain cells, etc. The blood is not actually in direct contact with them. So you can imagine that the capillary is exchanging with the tissue fluid, and then the tissue fluid is exchanging with the cells. There's exchange happening here between the blood and the tissue fluid, and then there is exchange happening between the tissue fluid and the cells. So again, it's the tissue fluid that's in direct contact with the body cells, and once again, it's similar to plasma, but it contains fewer proteins than the plasma because the proteins are filtered out as the fluid is pushed through the gaps between the cells and the capillary wall. Now, as mentioned, this produces a bunch of excess fluid, and that fluid needs to be returned to the blood, otherwise we would quickly deplete our blood volume, and that's the job of the lymphatic system. The excess fluid is picked up by the lymphatic system to be returned to the blood. Let's look at that in more detail now. So here's another diagram in more detail. We have the arterial side and the venous side, and then we have this capillary bed here. And as the blood flows through, we can see with these little blue arrows that fluid is leaving the capillaries and going into the surrounding tissues. And we see these blind-ending green vessels. These are lymphatic capillaries, or lymph capillaries, that are picking up that excess fluid. And once the tissue fluid gets into the lymphatic vessels, we just call it lymph. So lymph is similar in composition to the interstitial or the tissue fluid. Interstitial and tissue fluid meaning the same thing, and they're similar to plasma except they contain fewer proteins. So it's the job of the lymphatic system to pick up that excess fluid, and then it's going to carry it away and empty it back into the veins. The lymphatic system actually has several functions. One is returning that excess filtered fluid to the blood, but it also has an immune function. It houses white blood cells, that's what WBC stands for, and filters and destroys pathogens. So here is a look at the lymphatic system throughout your body. And you can see that there are many places where there are lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are these bean-like structures that house white blood cells that are important in the immune response. And if you've ever had a doctor or someone feel your neck for quote-unquote swollen glands, they're not actually feeling for glands. They're feeling for lymph nodes, because those can get large and inflamed when you are responding to, for example, a bacterial infection in the area. So the lymphatic system has an important immune function housing white blood cells that respond to pathogens. And it also has a third function, which might seem totally different from the others. It's actually involved in picking up fat absorbed in the small intestine using structures called lacteals that are in the intestinal villi. So here's a picture of a single intestinal villus, and the gut lumen is over here, and nutrients are being absorbed into the capillaries here, shown in red and blue, to be carried off into the blood system. But that is only going to be able to absorb hydrophilic nutrients. Hydrophobic nutrients, which don't dissolve in the plasma of the blood, are going to go here into this green-colored lymphatic blind-ending structure here, and that's called a lacteal, and that's going to carry it into the venous system. So the lacteal is involved in picking up hydrophobic nutrients, fat-soluble nutrients that don't dissolve in the plasma, and it does that in the intestinal villi. A further look here at the structure of the lymphatic system. Those lymphatic vessels, just like capillaries, are only made of endothelium. They don't have muscle or elastic tissue or connective layer outside. They're just endothelium, just like capillaries. And just like veins, actually, they have valves in them. The valves, like veins, prevent the lymphatic, or the lymph rather, from going backwards. And they also don't have a pump. The lymphatic fluid, the lymph, is not being pumped by the heart. It is being moved along by the muscle pump, just like we saw with veins. The lymphatic vessels go through muscles, and when the surrounding muscle moves, it squishes that lymph along and keeps it moving. And that's why, by the way, if you ever injure yourself and you have to immobilize an area, it can get quite swollen. If you've twisted an ankle, something like that. First of all, there's swelling because your capillaries get leakier. So that's one reason why your ankle swells. But another reason is that you're not moving the muscles around it, so you're not squishing the lymph back towards the veins. Now, where does the lymph empty into the venous system? Well, it actually empties into the veins just below your clavicles or your collarbones. There's an area up here in the diagram where they empty back into the venous system, just under your collarbones. And lastly, just as mentioned, the lymph nodes, which are dotted throughout here and concentrated in a few different areas, like in your neck, in your armpits, and here around your groin, those lymph nodes are bean-like structures which contain white blood cells, and they're important for the immune response. And again, they're what's being felt for when a doctor feels for quote-unquote swollen glands. So that's a quick look at the lymphatic system and its several functions.